is our second Shoreland training. It'll be pretty similar to last year as far as it being more informative, but we're going to focus on 3 topics today. Have tons and tons of pictures, and then staff are just going to kind of chime in each different topic. And Shirley, can you hear us still online?
Yes, I can. Thank you very much.
Okay, perfect. Just wanted to make sure.
Thank you.
Okay, so the goals for today, like I said, we're going to focus on 3 topics: impervious surface, drainage and stormwater, and retaining walls. And then we're going to provide examples of each of those topics and then discuss their importance and significance. The reason why these topics were chosen is because I would say they've been the most reoccurring kind of issues we've had. Like either there's a ton of questions or applications for these 3 different things. And it's just something that it's important to kind of know about. It's kind of been kind of our big ones, I would say, that we've had problems with. And I just want to revisit this topic again. Last year, lakescaping. So it's that balance between yes, come. Because of the, just say who's here. Okay, yeah, we can do. Okay, we'll do kind of first just who's here. So obviously Holly from Environmental Services, and then we have Aaron Stubbs, the zoning administrator. Gary Bennett, he's one of the area hydrologists from the DNR. I guess it would be more like Lake Washington. Well, it's kind of more most of our county, really. Just where the Cannon River watershed is, that's where his jurisdiction would be within the county, basically. So Todd People, who's not here, he's the other area hydrologist. Yep. And then, so you'll probably see their permits and their names on a lot of documents. And then we have John too. He's the new planning and zoning technician. So if you don't recognize John, did you need me? Is that good? Right? Sorry. Yeah, I kind of forget. I get in go mode.
I just want to make sure people.
Yep. No, who's here?
There is somebody else in the room.
Yep. Yeah. Good point. Thank you. Yep. No problem. So, we revisited this topic just from last year. It was lakescaping, which is that balance between human needs and then also and priorities with the needs and priorities of the lake's ecosystem. That's really the whole goal of at least for our offices, that we're addressing both, landowners' needs and also the lake's needs or rivers, the resources needs. So these are examples of lakescaping. This particular landowner actually has 2 BMPs on their property. They have riprap and a native vegetation buffer, and then they also have a rain garden up by their house. So there's still plenty of area for grass. So if the grandkids want to play in the grass or they need to get access to the dock, they can still do that. But also they're providing some, habitat essentially with the rain garden, and then also the buffer, and then, protection from erosion from the lake. This is on Lake Volney with the riprap. And the rain garden also stores stormwater. So again, lakescaping, it's not to say that you can't use your shoreline property, but there's advantages to having native vegetation and BMPs installed while still the landowners being able to use their property. And then this is another example. This is a pretty large rain garden that's on Lake Emily. I think it's like a community garden for the Lake Marie Avenue or Drive. This was engineered, and it's pretty cool. It's almost been 10 years and it's still doing pretty well. There's just minimal maintenance that they've had to do with the plants. But there is a tile that runs up closer to the road and then comes down through the property, through the rain garden, and then it infiltrates first through that rain garden before it goes into the lake. So impervious surface, that's our first topic. So the definition of impervious surface, and this is right from our ordinance, is a constructed hard surface that either prevents or retards the entry of water into the soil and causes water to run off the surface in greater quantities and at an increased rate of flow than prior to development. So some examples would be roofs, sidewalks, decks, and patios, driveways, parking lots, compacted soil. So it doesn't just have to be concrete or something like that. Like if people are parking on grass, That's compacted soil, so that's impervious surface. You are limiting and preventing that water from percolating, infiltrating into the soil. Storage areas, retaining walls, concrete, asphalt. So there's all different kinds of examples. I know in the past we've had whether a deck should be considered impervious surface or not. The main reason why we count it towards impervious surface is because more than likely there'll be some type of patio underneath that deck or some hard surface. So granted, water can like flow through the deck, but there's still something impervious underneath, so we count it.
Say they had a deck like that. And the water could go through it, and underneath was pervious. Would let the water go down. That good faith, doing the right thing too? Say they had a patio underneath, they're trying to get permit for something else, they took the, because this happened. Take the concrete out and leave it as grass or whatever it might be, then they still gotta take the deck and do boards on and stuff, so it's really I don't understand.
It's tricky. It's still impacting how water flows, though. I will say that, and that doesn't just because they don't have anything there now doesn't mean they'll put something there in the future. So I think in order to, it's a gray line, right? Like it's really hard to like figure out what actually makes sense. But I think to be on the safe side, I would say if we just count it as impervious, because half the people are probably not going to have anything there, and then half the people are. So where do you draw the line? So I think that's kind of the main reason why we count it as impervious surface. It is allowed within Shoreland, but as you know, it can only essentially being permitted without needing a variance. It can't be a maximum more than 25% of the lot is impervious surface. And it's not allowed within the shore impact zone except for stairways, paths, walkways right now. And water-oriented structures. We are looking through ordinance revisions now. One of the things we talked about was allowing up to 100 square feet of impervious surface in the shore impact zone for things like a small patio or something, because or like a shed or something, like a small shed. We've talked about that. So that's one of the proposed revisions that we'll see how it goes through the board and everything, but that in the public meeting, but that's one of the things we talked about. But keeping it pretty minimal because it's still having an impact to the property.
Would that be like a boathouse?
Isn't that considered
Would that be an example?
a water-oriented structure? Yeah, so boathouse would be a water-oriented structure. I'm thinking more of like, I knew for sure, I'm trying to think of a boardwalk, yeah, something like that. Because a detached deck would also count as a water-oriented structure. Some people just want like a little sitting area, like a fire pit, right? And they want like a little patio around that fire pit or something. That would be a good example. Just something really small. We don't want it huge, don't want to get crazy with it, but it kind of comes up time and time again. So instead of saying no, we just maybe limiting the size would be a more way to count for that.
Because currently right now, ordinance reads out of the impact zone, we can put a 100 square foot shed down there, meeting setbacks without a variance. You gotta be 10 feet.
250.
250 square feet?
You can up to 250. Yep,
250, okay,
just one of them.
right, that's what I meant. But the setbacks, whatever it is.
Yep, it's the 10 feet.
10 feet.
Yep. Okay, and I know I mentioned this last time at the training, but again, it's really important on how to continue these conversations when we look at these examples. So why does it matter where impervious surface is located? Well, for example, this is a bluff and it's no longer there. This is actually on Lake Totaka. And what happened was the landowners, so we had a lot of conversations about the reasoning why this happened. There was a lot of rain, so this was in 2016. There was a ton of rain. I think it was at least 4 or 5 inches, maybe more. And prior to that rainfall event, patio was being constructed at the top of the bluff. Additionally, there was work being done, steps and stairs within the bluff. So it was a recipe for a disaster because that was going on, and then we just had a big rainfall. And then this is the result of that. I don't have the picture up here, but like part of the erosion, like the dirt in the tree was out in the lake. It wasn't a good scenario. It was an emergency at that point, a lot of permitting and So that's a prime example of why it matters. We don't want to put a lot of pressure on top of the bluff because it's super sensitive. Having setbacks is really important for that reason. And it's hard to say what would happen if they didn't do it. I mean, rain still has an impact, but yeah, it didn't help the situation with the rain. It definitely made it worse. Well, so on top of this, they had to fix it, right? Like, this is obviously an eyesore. We didn't really have a problem for pollution within the lake. We didn't really have emergency stabilization kind of language in there to fix something like this. So the landowners just went ahead and fixed it, but didn't get any permitting. I know we worked with them. They had to get a variance first before they got a conditional use permit, but it's kind of just been sitting in limbo. They came in for the variance and never like addressed it. What they ended up doing was putting a bunch of retaining walls in, a bunch of them, even the steps. And the steps, in my opinion, were excessive. I mean, some of the retaining walls were probably up to the top of that picture right there. And like so they did that for the steps, and it was like varying heights. I don't know how many they had, but it still hasn't been addressed. And now those retaining walls are failing by the steps too. Surprise, surprise. So like they tried to fix it, but didn't have the permitting to do it, and now they're kind of stuck in a weird spot because if they want to move forward with that project to fix it, they would need an engineer to sign off on retaining walls, and they would need after-that CPs. Yep, but
See the debris, Holly, that's
Yep.
in the water.
Yep.
It's fall under, forgiving would be enforcement. Let's say the debris in the water, trees in the water. You don't want that sitting in there, right? I mean, how do they get that out of there?
Seen it all. I mean, they're trying to get, definitely not easy. It's gonna be.
So do they have to, let's say it happens to somebody that we're gonna have to deal with, I'm sure we're gonna deal with it. Do they have to get an E&I permit to get it out of there? Then you move it up in the land, and it triggers the impact zone,
You know,
and then goes to the county.
I think technically in a situation like this, they want, so first of all, if this occurred because of a 5-inch rain, it was kind of an act of God thing. You know, maybe unfortunately, DNR rules wouldn't require them to remove that. If they did purposely put it in there, it was kind of an act of God. So we wouldn't require them to remove the sediment from the lake. We don't want it in there. So I think given those circumstances, we would probably not require a permit.
then currently to fix it, you would need a conditional use permit. So that's what we talked about, maybe making some revisions to the ordinance for sections for this, because this is an emergency, not just because someone wants to fix it, right? A little leeway, they would still have to come back to get a conditional use permit later, but at least then we could prevent any additional erosion and pollution going into the lake. But yeah, that's an extreme example of something that didn't work out so well. I don't know exactly the story of this whole property. I just found these pictures. Again, this is kind of the same story with the bluff erosion. I don't know if it was rain, impervious surface, but I mean, where this is located, and luckily they don't have a lot going on within the shore impact zone of the bluff. I mean, mostly they have their steps, but I mean, if something like this happens, it's going to take whatever it is with it, right, when it's there. So limiting the amount of impervious surface in the bluff, shore impact zone is important because of these reasons. Whether you did it on purpose or not, or act of God, nature, we don't want stuff like this happening to the bluff or to the shore impact zone. So the footprint and reducing your footprint is important because of these reasons. And then here's another. I'm using a lot more bluff examples. This is a patio right on top of the bluff in by Cape Horn. So eventually this landowner ended up having to remove the patio. I can't remember if they got a permit for it or not, but again, like the bluff is literally right here, and now you have all this impervious surface at the top, plus the house is right here, and you know, a lot of those lake lots are small to begin with. So trying to find, you know, a better solution. There's already a deck there and patio right here. Is this really necessary? I mean, it's putting a lot of pressure on the bluff. So just trying to reduce again the footprint, and I believe the landowner put some native plants like on the top of the bluff line to help with stabilization. But another example of why it matters.
does the county treat, impervious surface coverage? How is pavers?
Yeah, that's a tough one. So we've kind of talked about it as staff. It's tricky. Number one, construction for pervious pavers requires a lot more depth than you would think. Like typically, I think I've seen at least 6 inches, but could be 12 inches or more. So then you got to look at the grading, excavating, and filling component of that. Do you need a CUP for that or not? You know, where is it located? The problem that we're seeing most is people aren't maintaining it. So they install it, trying to get by, so they don't have to get the variance for the, you know, impervious surface, and then it gets clogged up. So then over time, it becomes, the pervious surface becomes impervious. So one thing we've talked about is requiring an operation and maintenance plan, at least having that, so it kind of holds their feet to the fire. I personally think there's not enough data to support that this is, like pervious pavers would be the best idea. I've recommended maybe doing sidewalks or patios, something smaller where it's less likely to get clogged, like a driveway. More than likely, you're gonna have a lot more foot traffic, you know, vehicle traffic. There's gonna be a lot more debris that probably will clog it out, like clog it up. And, you know, even winter is part of an issue in far as maintenance goes with these pervious pavers. So when I talk to people, I take it with a grain of salt and just emphasize that maintenance is a requirement if you're going to install it, because otherwise it becomes impervious and then we're back to square one. Talked about doing partial credit maybe for it, but I don't know. It's a difficult topic. I don't have a great answer other than I recommend not to do it if you don't have to. Yes.
Maybe the more harm driveway because it's changed. There's studies show that they work.
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing that they don't work, but people aren't maintaining them, so then it defeats the whole purpose of having pervious pavers. So that's where it gets tricky as staff, because unless we start requiring them to submit every year, like when they, you know, or we do site checks for operation and maintenance, there's not a whole lot of support or data that says it's good. I'm not saying that they're a bad idea, but the operation and maintenance is key to making them work. There's also these like geogrid things that you can install, and then you can have grass in between it. Like that might be a little bit better option because at least you're not digging, you know, a foot down and putting fill in, and it's still pervious because it has the grass in between. Like I've been trying to recommend different options like that. Another option you can do with pervious pavers is if you have a driveway, you could do maybe the sides of it, or the areas you don't use, you know, if it's kind of like you use it to back up your car, maybe just having those areas as pervious pavers and the rest is your typical, you know, concrete. So we've tried to work with people in different alternatives like that instead of just saying, yep, go ahead, put a big pervious driveway in, because people just aren't going to maintain it.
Gonna go out and look at.
Yeah.
Well, I don't disagree, and that, I think that's what she's saying is,
Yeah.
so even if we said, hey, yes, you can do this, but you have to give us an annual plan, now it gets installed and we don't get them. What do we do? Go out there and tear it up?
What's the annual plan gonna be?
Right, that's why we,
This is the document you're gonna put in the old file.
that's why we're not in favor.
Yeah, thank you.
That's why I just recommend people not doing it and finding different alternatives so we don't have to go down that road. If they want to do it, then we could have serious conversations about it. And I guess we review it a little bit more strictly and just remind them, hey, like this is what is required of it, basically. This is another example of why it matters. So,
Totally back.
yeah, I won't get into this
Well, I know where
one.
this one is.
Yeah, it's
in my area.
yeah, so I'm not really happy about this property. I worked really hard to have conversations with this landowner. Like I had spent at least 10 hours, maybe more, about filling out a land alteration plan, talking about driveways and what's allowed, what's not allowed. The story behind this property was they had a house there, they removed it, but weren't able to put it back essentially. So there was kind of like a weird patio now that's left where the foundation of the house was. Very limited on what you can do on this lot. It also has bluff, of course. to make it more complicated, right? And we had an agreement about putting gravel on the driveway, just resurfacing it, because if it's there and you're just resurfacing it, that's okay. It's when you go above and beyond and you expand it, and guess what happened? They took that approval and ran with it, and then did the concrete, expanded it, did some work in the bluff. Yeah, this one was a tough one. So we don't want to see this. And like, obviously, this is compacted. You can see all the gravel here. I think there was some concrete back here. So that's a straight highway from the top of the road all the way down to the lake. That's why that matters. We don't want that. And putting at least some type of, like rain garden or something for storage or water diversion would be great, but I still don't think that's enough. This lot just isn't designed for this.
Neighbors, because.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you hadn't heard about this.
Oh, yeah. I was out to this property at least 5 or 6 times, still getting calls. Imagine that will happen in the future. This is something it's rare, but I don't want to see it.
Maybe the house on the tan house up to the north of the property, then there's a house to the.
Yep.
south.
Yep. And so this is why, yeah, this one's a tough one to swallow. Worked really hard to try to do the right thing with the landowner, make sure that we had all of our ducks in a row, don't add all this impervious surface, and that's what happened. So I just want to show some examples of the surveys and just kind of talk about different examples and different scenarios. I think it really helps as far as kind of, I guess, gauging impervious surface in general. So currently with this survey, the existing conditions, basically there is 19.6% of impervious surface for the lot. So they're not over the 25%, so that's a good checkbox. If you kind of do the math as far as where the impervious surface is located, and here's the lake, here's the OHW. What's really tricky, this trips me up all the time. The lake's also over here, so now you gotta look at this OHW and this one. And so it makes it really complicated, right? And so over 1,500 square feet of impervious surface is located in the shore impact zone. So that 50 feet from the OHW, which equates to 11.1%. So we're talking about half of the impervious surface is located within the shore impact zone. So remember, I said they weren't over the 25%, right? But over half of their impervious surface is in the shore impact zone. That's different in my mind, a huge difference. And so, and that equates to about 56.9%. So granted, again, they're not over an impervious surface, but over half of their impervious surface is in the shore impact zone. We have to look at things differently that way because it does make a difference when people are proposing things. Okay, so then what they did was, wait, I need to back up for a second because this is really important. We had a couple of these. This house, and I'll show another example. This house in concrete was right here. They wanted to dig out a new basement, put a new structure on. Great. Initially, these landowners did not want to budge and move the house outside the shore impact zone. They just wanted to put it back here. So staff had discussions and we're like, okay, well, if you're digging a new basement, building a new house, why wouldn't you back up this house outside the shore impact zone? And, you know, they would have to do some kind of variance and setbacks for like the septic tank, but they're going to need that anyway. This lot is very goofy because of the OHW and the lake over here and over here. No matter what they were going to do, they were going to need a variance. But the variance that they're requesting is for the septic, and it was a way to mitigate it. The septic was kind of more in the middle, and the house was outside the shore impact zone. It made a huge difference on their impervious surface. So what they did was they ended up moving the house outside the shore impact zone, which was a plus, and they still needed all those variances for the setbacks. And they reduced their impervious surface and went down to 18.9%. It's a better application. They're still, you know, are going to need a variance because of the lot. But so remember when I said that over 56% of their impervious surface was in the shore impact zone? When they moved that house, there was 4 square feet left in the shore impact zone, which is 0.002% of their impervious surface in the shore impact zone. Isn't that crazy? Like, that's a huge difference. So they were gonna need a variance no matter what, but this time it was just for setbacks. We didn't have to worry about anything else. Much better proposal. Okay. This one was a doozy too. I have a lot of doozy ones for you. So there's a house right there. Again, there's a concrete structure, pavers, retaining walls, sheds, all sorts of stuff, right? And I think this property might have been a legal non-conformity. So some of the stuff that was built there wasn't even permitted to be there. Working with the landowners. Again, they wanted to move their house and they were gonna have to do some dirt work anyway, because essentially it's just flat. It's almost like a walkout basically for this property. And so there was a total of 29% impervious surface for the lot. They're over the 25%, but 15.4% of that impervious surface was located within the shore impact zone. So again, about half of the impervious surface was in the shore impact zone. And this is kind of what the lot looked like. I'm not going to get into too many details. They needed to replace the foundation. It wasn't good. Like it was falling and crumbling. There was a need to replace the house.
There was a lot of battle.
Yes.
I was there.
It was a difficult one. We went round and round and round again. So we finally got a resolution, right? So we were able to get that house outside the shore impact zone. They still had the patio within the shore impact zone and the deck, but the structure wasn't. The shed was moved outside. Again, they needed setbacks for their septic tank and whatnot. They were over by 0.9% impervious surface. I would argue that they could have gotten down to the 25%. This was a tricky one. But as far as reduction goes, I guess for total impervious surface, they reduced it by 3.1%. So that's a plus. 733 square feet or 24.7% of the impervious surface on the lot was located within the shore impact zone now. So we cut it in about half. So that's good, right? And then we would argue that, yeah, like I said, that they could get down 0.9%. But that was kind of the tricky part. At least, I mean, they reduced their impervious surface on their shore impact zone by over 1,000 square feet. It was a huge improvement, but I still would argue that they could have gotten down to 25%. They were really, really close. They just needed to maybe reduce it a little bit more. Now we're proposing for ordinance revisions of allowing 100 square feet of impervious surface in the shore impact zone. So hopefully that would alleviate the patio and the deck that are currently there. Now they don't have practical difficulty because we are allowing 100 square feet of impervious surface in the shore impact zone. I think that would alleviate some of the issues we were having because they were still wanting to be in the shore impact zone as much as possible. But they still had to get a variance for setbacks too. Number 3. So this one's a little tricky. Lake Washington. I guess the biggest takeaway from this property is, well, they were going to add a pool. I think they added a garage. They changed that. My big takeaway with this is the road. The road accounted for, it's a private road or township road, and then there's a private road up there. But that road accounted for over 1,000 square feet of their impervious surface. And if we didn't include that road within their impervious surface calculation, they would have met to 25%. It's a different way of looking at things, right? Like road is one thing, but the lot, they added the pool, the house addition. I think they had an apron all the way around the pool, but in order to kind of make things work, we reduced it. They're still over it on impervious surface, but a huge part of it is the road. It's a different way of looking at things, right? So it's just a good example of how different these projects can be. And I wrote the letter for this particular property. I did mention that the road was accounting for a huge chunk of the impervious surface. Technically not their fault. So it's a different way of looking at things. Reduction of impervious surface. I think I showed this example last year. So this landowner had, well, the water was high then, and they had a retaining wall and a sidewalk. I said, hey, do you really need that retaining wall or sidewalk? Is it really doing anything for a purpose for you? Is that something we could reduce? And they did, and it looks a lot better, right? Like that was something that they didn't necessarily need, and it made a huge improvement on their lot. They did get a conditional use permit to bring in some fill, and then rip wrap their shoreline, and they can protect their boathouse. And it was just an easy way to reduce impervious surface and made a huge difference for their lot. Okay, reduction of impervious surface here. I'm going too fast, I know. This lot also had a lot of impervious surface. What's funny is, remember that driveway picture I showed you? This is the neighbor. So they both have a lot of impervious surface. This one's at 68.5%. So that's a crazy amount of impervious surface. And again, the driveway goes all the way down to the lake. There's a house, they have 2 garages and a deck. There isn't a lot of room here to do anything, I guess, up front. They did have some retaining walls. I think originally when they applied for the permit, it was to replace some of the retaining walls. So that's when we had the conversation about impervious surface. So that's the straight highway all the way to the lake, right there again. And then the retaining walls, you can see, were really crummy and definitely need to be replaced. So we went around and around with the landowner again, and they were able to reduce their impervious surface by 9%. So it's not great, but 10% is a huge reduction. There were some things that they couldn't remove, but then basically the driveway other down the lake, they were able to remove that and just put sod there. That was a really good improvement. It reduced the impervious surface within the shore impact zone, and it just reduced their impervious surface in general by a lot. I would argue they could reduce it more. So that's kind of, these are tricky because it was there before, whether it was permitted or not, I don't even know, but they did reduce the impervious surface by a lot. These are kind of the things we talk with landowners and try to figure out what can we reduce? What makes the most sense? In this case, the driveway, they didn't really need one all the way down to the lake. So that's where that was our big goal. Okay, so this is existing and proposed. I think I showed this example earlier. So their current impervious surface was at 23.1%. And what they did was, when they proposed to add a shed and a gravel surface, they reduced some of the impervious surface. Those 2 sheds up there, they're gone. And those are in the shore impact zone too. So that's really like a really good improvement. This is a really good example of how the landowners work with staff. They still need the variance for their septic and for the shed, for the setbacks, but they were able to reduce impervious surface within the shore impact zone. They still were able to add a shed, add their gravel parking area, because I don't think they had one, and then they were able to keep their impervious surface at 25%. This is what we strive to do, work with the landowner these different options. This is the goal, something like this. If they can. They can't always work this way because lots, usually on Lake Shore, are pretty small. A lot of them are non-conforming, but this is what we'd like to see. Okay, let's take a break for a second. Impervious surface. Got any questions? Like, I don't know, were the examples, were they helpful? Is this something that makes sense to you?
It does. A couple of them. Take them to the.
Yep.
Which is not good at all.
Right.
And so at the time, trouble with the bluff, changing the bluff as it is without.
Yep.
So hard with some of these people to get them to stand. Just can't allow it because of what's going to happen. One of the cities, and they think, oh, protect that shoreline.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Big. Oh, so this comes up a lot. So people are like, oh, Holly, I have all this erosion and runoff on my property. Okay, I said, what does that look like? You know, I ask them all these questions, get more detail. And then they're like, oh, I want to add this stuff right on top of the buffer next to the lake. And I was like, if you have erosion problems on your property, do you think the best thing to do is just to add more of this impervious surface where the problems are? I catch people on that a lot. So I don't know if they don't quite understand what erosion and runoff means, or if it's just, this is what they want, and they just want to go through with it. Either way, it's a tough conversation to have, but those questions are really important to ask people because it catches them and they're like, oh, kind of dawns on them. Like, we have to do I'm not saying that people can't use the lake, they can't have a boathouse, shed, whatever, but we have to think about where they're putting it and the reasoning if it's okay, especially if they have prior issues. We gotta keep that into consideration before we say, yep, this is good to go or not. That's like one of the biggest things I run into. Impervious surface is probably one of the toughest conversations. Sometimes we can ask them if they're willing to do some best management practices. That works. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes people want to budge, sometimes not. I always say to people, hey, like, I know this doesn't seem like a big deal to you. You're one property, right? But now imagine if every property was just like you and they were over an impervious surface and they wanted the same thing. That is a lot different. And especially if they all reduce something or implement a best management practice, that's when it makes a difference. So even though it's one property, it might not seem like a big deal, but it is. It definitely is, and I think a lot of things have changed even maybe more so between now and 20, 30, 40 years ago. I think we've gotten better at that, but now it's just trying to get those people when they do apply and they need additional permitting to kind of think about those things and find ways to reduce. We're not asking to remove everything. Obviously, we wouldn't ask someone to remove their house. I mean, that's unreasonable, right? But there's got to be something that they can do. So it doesn't always have to be like this big reduction. 10, 20%, but something is better than nothing. That's what I always tell people. Something is better than nothing, even if it's 1%.
Look at impervious surface, how we do our job.
Yep.
I know the city's water bill and the statute by Shoreland rules or other rules. They have a lot of water going off their campus. That's just the way it is, the nature of the beast, so right by the water.
Right.
Well, is there money out there, resources for those folks? I mean, it's for another day, but they have a lot of water going in, or runoff water going into their lakes. I mean,
Yeah.
Yep.
Cities are hard because obviously we don't have jurisdiction. They also usually have even more, like less resources than we have. So then it becomes the conversation about what do they have currently. And I have talked to both, like, for example, the city of Waterville and Elysian, and we've had conversations. They'll call and ask how you handle these things. As far as what they allow and don't allow, it would be nice if they could do more trainings and stuff and come and have conversations, but that's a tough thing to swallow because there's only so much we can do here, but it doesn't hurt to have conversations, invite them to things, give them resources, but they do contact me and call me, and I'm sure they've contacted the office too about projects. So it's just nice, at least we have that partnership and communication. But yeah, I wish things were different and we could help them out more, I guess.
Are the cities using the 25%?
They should be, yep.
So I can comment. So cities are a little bit different than counties. When the DNR established the state shoreline standards, every county was required to adopt shoreline management ordinance. The cities, we looked at individually and we looked at, well, what water resources does that city have? What is the developmental pressure on those water bodies? And we ranked them from priority 1 to priority 4. And we only require the priority 1 and priority 2 communities to adopt the shoreline management ordinance. We've got a lot of smaller communities, and some not even that small, like St. Peter. They don't have a. But yeah, it's a bit of a mixed bag with cities because they all don't have a shoreline ordinance. But the ones that do have to adopt the same 25% impervious surface standard.
Do you know, top of your head, what cities in our county? Do all cities in our county have shoreline, or you would know?
No, I have to look it up, but I'm quite certain all cities do not have. It's like.
Keep moving on. Okay, this next topic, drainage. It's a difficult topic. I hate drainage. If I didn't have to deal with drainage, I would love that. I get a lot of calls, and more so now than ever, about drainage occurring on property, and people are having issues, and usually it's not their fault. It might be across the road on some ag field. It might be their neighbors. I can't, like regulate drainage, right? Like that is something that we can't really do as far as enforcing, like if they have drainage issues on their property, I'm more than happy to go take a look, provide recommendations for best management practices, but in the end, there's like nothing we can really do if the neighbor doesn't want to do anything. That's why I don't like drainage, because it's difficult. And the answer isn't always right there. Sometimes it's way further upstream or upslope, and it's hard. So I just want to talk about a couple different definitions. So runoff, which is I think that's the portion of precipitation on an area that does not soak into the soil or becomes trapped in depressions and is discharged from an area on the land surface either in sheet or channelized flow. Stormwater is stormwater runoff, snow melt runoff, and surface runoff and drainage. And drainage is the natural artificial removal of a surface's water and subsurface water from an area with excess water. And drainage could be, stormwater, or it could be egg. Like there's I do two different types of drainage. And they both, I guess both have they're both very difficult to work with, but they also have different solutions on how to fix them. So I only have two examples, but I think they're really, really powerful. So I find a little doodle here. So this contractor drew a site plan, and what was happening was there's two properties. This is on West Jeff, I believe. What would happen was the water would flow where the red arrow is going, and here's a beach sand blanket. And so it would cut through their property through these trees. And there was a drainage easement. They had like a little culvert right there. Drove around, looked on site, tried to figure out how big the watershed was. It wasn't really big at all. Like there was a berm by the road, and then it kind of just curved around. I don't know the square footage, but it was pretty small. So I was having a hard time figuring out where this was coming from. There was ditches, but basically ran through the property. I don't have the video with me, but I remember watching it, and it was just a sheet full of water coming essentially from that driveway and just going across the property, the neighbor's property. I mean, it looked like a little river. It was ridiculous. And so these landowners were looking for help on what to do. Basically, this is the result of it. So when it would cut in between the trees, between the two properties, it would cut over. And this is what was happening to the beach sand blanket. And you can see it's just eating it away. So what we did, I would say this is kind of a heavy duty rain garden. It might be more like a mini basin in my mind. It's a little deep, but we installed this basin / rain garden, and they kind of rocked where the culvert was, and then the water would sit in this basin or rain garden and would be able to infiltrate. There was also a tile connected to it in case it needed the emergency flow. Essentially, if it got too full, it would still be able to exit without spilling over. And they added some vegetation also.
What is the Sueur County standard on like inch of rain or?
I don't think we necessarily have like a specific standard with that. We have like capacity size, but we don't really have anything above and beyond that. I've been trying a lot harder now with rain gardens to use NRCS specs. So I think it's like you have to capture 7%, at least 7% of the water, the impervious surface, and that gives you like a good idea for sizing, but we don't have any like rain inch flows or anything like that. I wish I had more time and capacity to design these. So unless it's a soil and water project, just using best judgment on these projects. I haven't been out there recently. I need to go out when it rains because I want to see how this works and take some videos, but they planted some vegetation. This was just the first year, so things were still growing, but essentially, again, the water would fill up here first. There is tile, and then would go to the lake. So that was the solution for fixing that erosion on that problem, for that specific problem. We did see this earlier at our other presentation. So a little background on this. This is on Lake Boney. That watershed has had serious problems as far as runoff and erosion and just like drainage issues galore. And so what happened was this result of this issue was a combination of both impervious surface or stormwater runoff and also agricultural runoff. So what the soil and water ended up doing was creating spaces across the road in agricultural land, and then they also did some work with the culvert This was a lot of engineering. It took a lot of time to fix it. But this is essentially what was happening. And I think these landowners had this problem for years, before they could essentially fix it. So you can see it's just like funneling through, and again, it's through, two different properties. It would come across the road by a shed, for this landowner on the right, and then it would just, a huge sheet flow, and it would just go straight to the lake. So it was flooding everything. I don't think I may not have the other video. But front, it was pouring over on the shoreline, and it was just eating things out. This took a lot of work and a lot of engineering. This is something that I couldn't even design. There's no way. I don't have the capacity, but sometimes we're dealing with things like that. And in that case, I would highly recommend that we have an engineer to do it, because it's a lot of water, right? The good news is that works now. The basins and what the engineers found out and design, it works well. The water goes right where it's supposed to, and then it exits with some tiles. So it doesn't flow, that sheet flow into the properties. But that is something, oh, here's the other video. So this is looking from the lake side. This is what it was doing.
This how they get?
Lake Volney. Yep, so the soil and water received a grant and was able, this is one of the projects they were able to work on. Made a huge difference for that watershed. It still has a lot of issues, but this was a big project, a big check for them, for sure.
Three or 4 years ago?
Yeah, a couple of years ago, I think the grant started in 2015, so I think that was just a few years ago that one got.
Got done, and I just think they do it again.
Oh,
Structure.
yeah, Asbo was 2017, so that was quite a while ago. Yeah, so, but they did a lot of work. I mean, again, this was engineered. I don't think it would be any way around it other than to engineer it. This type of stuff is really complicated. This is major big drainage issues. We see it sometimes we don't. But when I talk about drainage, it's a difficult beast. It's really hard to figure out what's going on. We can give suggestions to staff, but sometimes it takes an engineer to resolve it. And this is why stormwater runoff is really important, and even agriculture runoff. So when we look at properties, we have to see how it's impacting, because we don't want something like this to happen. This is a really like extreme example, but this is the kind of stuff that happens with drainage issues. And then basically they did all the work, and then they ended up recapping the shoreline and putting, I think they have native vegetation there too. So it looks much better now, and I've checked it out a couple of times. And I've talked to the landowners a few times too, and they're pretty happy with the project. Any question about drainage? Like sometimes you don't.
Yeah, some people think they
Yep.
want to.
Yeah, it's too complicated.
And the thing is, it's not just in the county. Number of property. They didn't care. Yeah. But it had to be done. Right. And if you don't do it, then we'll do it, and you can pay for it on your, because you can't continue your neighbors taking care of it.
When the county reviews Shoreland preliminary subdivision plats within a shoreline area, obviously stormwater management is something you're going to want to take a close look at and have requirements on.
We just had an example that a project came in and it was new development, and they talked about stormwater. They didn't talk about how they were going to maintain it and stuff. So like operation and maintenance, again, is really, really important. You can say you have a basin. Who's going to maintain it? Who owns it? Like those are the kind of questions we have, because it looks good on paper to have it, but someone's got to take care of it, because we want to prevent things like that happening. So it's just something to think about with these projects. I wish everyone could do a, you know, a stormwater BMP on their property, but that's not the reality of it. So with those bigger projects, like that's really important in what we look for.
Getting a flat as a retention area. It's tax on everybody. So can as a planning commission require association that they monitor and manage the retention pond? Or no?
So that gets to be a little tricky. Because, yeah, you can require them to create a homeowners association, but then they just disband it later. So what we did with this last plat was we required, long-term operation and maintenance plan. And then what the property owner did was he spoke with the township, and I was really, really surprised by this. But the township apparently stated they would take ownership and maintenance responsibility. Now, they haven't signed that agreement and submitted it yet, so we'll see, but he can't record his plat until he has that agreement in place. We'll see what they do with it, but that's certainly something.
Well, let's say the township says, hell no. Anyway, I know. Okay, then he's gotta sign off that he's gonna have to be, he still owns the back lots. You know, and someday he might wanna develop them, so he's really on the hook. I would make sure that damn well that he has to take care of that retention area. It's an underground filtration system, so that's gonna be a hell of a lot more to manage than above ground.
And he's been working with the county's engineer just to come up with a list of annual maintenance requirements that he should include. Because, you know, he's a property owner. He doesn't necessarily know annually what he's supposed to be doing to make sure that this continues to function. The land itself is in the trust, whether they set money aside, and that's why I explained to him that there's no doubt in my mind, this thing will work as designed for 5 years, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about 15 years down the line. Got to make sure there's no sediment in there and all that. It gets to be tricky, and there's limits to what we can require them.
Is it-
What protections we can put in place.
Pre-your time and Holly's time, there was a lot of these retention areas. Older subdivisions never had any ordinance. And Harold, past administrator, stated the county, in some way, form, or fashion, are kind of responsible for them if they really dig into it. That's not the case, what we want. We want
Don't
that,
want it all.
we want either the people that live in that association or somebody takes care of it. Right?
I don't disagree with you. I just don't know what the mechanism, that bulletproof mechanism is to keep it in place. Right?
Gary, have you seen anything on your area? Of course, that's above your
No,
pay grade.
Aaron and Holly are gonna have more experience than I would with something like that.
We better do some serious digging, see what happens.
Yeah.
What happens. Well, all of a sudden crap hits the fan and the retention pond or filtration system's not adequate anymore and nobody wants to fix it. And they'll come before the board, either current or ones in the future complaining to us, and then go to planning and zoning, complain to them. I gotta get it cleaned up. Why don't you clean it for me?
Yeah, Metro counties might be a good place to look, just because they deal with stormwater more, not that we don't, but they just have more project examples, all that. So maybe looking at some metro counties and kind of just asking them what they do might not be a bad idea. Just to kind of see.
Yeah, it would be, just look into, please check it out.
Any other questions about drainage?
Holly, this is Shirley.
Yep, go ahead, Shirley.
Yes, I did have a question. This is more industrial, however. Are you finding that there are more infiltration swales being used around the industrial sites instead of the costly detention bases?
That's a good question. I haven't really come across that with what I've worked with. I don't know, Aaron, if you've experienced that.
So the experience that I've had with it is it's based on soil type. Not all soils will take filtration basin. Sometimes retention pond is your only option. seen it both ways on solar projects specifically, where in some places they'll propose an infiltration basin, but won't have the right soil type. So then, but there too, when they submit that stuff, it's designed by an engineer. How do we as county planning and zoning staff verify that that's correct, right? Like when I worked in a previous county, we would, when we got these projects in, we would contract with an outside engineer to go through their specs. I gotta tell you, of the 4 or 5 that we did that with, every single one of them was wrong. Every single one of them had errors. Every single one of them needed revisions, which is a good thing ultimately for the county, but a bad thing when you think about they paid an engineer to design this and they weren't even paying attention to the soil type. They just, they want to get the design on paper and get it done. And if we hadn't spent that extra money, it wouldn't have worked. And so then the county's back at, well, you approved this. Well, yeah, we approved it, but planning and zoning and no one on the planning commission and no one on the county board, none of them are engineers. The county engineer is doing his day-to-day stuff with the highway. I don't think he wants to look at every one of them. I think that's a conversation for us to have. How do we handle this? We're gonna continue to see solar projects. We're gonna continue to see commercial development or industrial. How do we want to handle this in the future?
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? That's a good question, Shirley. Yeah, I guess my biggest thing with drainage is I don't have the capacity to, that's what I tell landowners, exactly what I tell them. I don't have the capacity to tell you what's gonna work, what doesn't work. Here's some ideas. But you would need an engineer, someone else has more expertise in this to figure out a solution. That's, unfortunately, that's the reality of it. Like, I don't know what else to tell them. And I think that's why I struggle with drainage, because there aren't a lot of good solutions. And if there are, they're expensive and they're time consuming. And so that's kind of what we run into. The last topic that we're going to talk about is retaining walls. So a retaining wall, technically, the definition of the Sueur County zoning ordinance is a row of boulders more than 30 inches in diameter. It's, within Shoreland, there's additional requirements as far as retaining walls based off the location. So, depending on where it's located, it's going to depend on what kind of permitting you'll need. And then additionally, the size, again, depending on the size will depend on what kind of permitting you'll need and if you need an engineer to certify it. So there's just some additional requirements within Shoreland. The purpose of retaining walls should be to reduce erosion. Some people have them for ornamental, it looks nice, but it's not really fulfilling a purpose. The problem with retaining walls is they're really expensive and they can negatively affect the lake by creating a barrier between the upland areas and the shoreline environment. So what I tell people about retaining walls is they should be a last resort. They shouldn't be your first go-to. When you're trying to figure out a solution on why you have erosion or runoff, you should be trying other things like vegetation or soil bioengineering practices first. It's a little bit different when they have an existing retaining wall. Then we have to take a look at that and see, okay, where is it located? What is the size? Like if it's only a foot tall, we could probably make that work. If it's holding a bluff back, we certainly don't just want to remove it because that's going to create a potential issue of the bluff sloughing. So those are the kind of things that we talk about before we talk about replacing it. But again, once you install it and it's a new retaining wall, it's going to have a major impact. So if there are things we can do before we install a new one, that should be the primary focus first, is to just think of alternatives before installing them. I don't really like retaining walls. They don't work. I mean, eventually they're going to fail. A lot of it has to do with water. So if you don't have like the proper tile or some type of drainage behind it to capture that water before it goes into the wall, I mean, it's going to make it fails. It does. And I have a ton of examples. I think you guys saw this last year. Lake Tatanka retaining wall. This was before, I think they got a permit. And so they had an existing retaining wall and they wanted to replace it. And so they ended up getting a permit for another retaining wall. And 30 days later, it failed. 30 days. Can you imagine that? 30 days. And I didn't find that out till after I had conversations and I went back out onto the property and it looked like that. And I was like, oh no, we have to fix this. How are we gonna fix this? And at this time, riprap wasn't counted as a permitted use, it was a conditional use, and that's, let me back up. So when initially we had conversations with these landowners, we suggested doing riprap and native vegetation instead of a retaining wall. They were dead set on the retaining wall, they got it, and it failed. So what happened was, they got a permit. Oh yeah, this is when I went back in 2020, I still don't think it was fixed yet. I can't remember. They must have, yeah, this was Josh, which was before me. It was like right before I got here, and this was one of the first projects I had to work on, and it was a tough one.
It just looks like, I mean, maybe it's deceiving, this looks like a project where DNR would require permit.
Yep. So then they came back for a conditional use permit. Basically, it's a seawall. That's how I view it, and they don't work. I'm sure more examples why they don't work. They end up failing because they're just not designed to withstand the water. They can't absorb that wave impact. They can't handle the water that's coming in behind them. They just don't work. And then a lot of retaining walls are also constructed out of limestone. So again, we talked about this earlier, about limestone zero erosive material. So preference is not to use limestone if possible. I always say it's not if they're gonna fail, it's when. It's always a when. Now some last longer than others. Don't get me wrong. If a retaining wall lasts 50 years, great. That one only lasted 30 days. So I don't know, like the shelf life, it's kind of dependent. So they came back to get a CUP, a conditional use permit for riprap and some vegetation. Did go out there recently. And we have riprap now. It looks a lot better. TBD on the vegetation, but if this was what they would have started with, they would have had to do more permitting, would have had to pay extra costs. Retaining walls are expensive. Don't really want you, like, in my opinion, like if they would have just done this from the start, it would have made all the world of a difference, and it was a headache for the landowner. The contractor, I don't know, like I tried to talk to him about it, and I think he was kind of scared to talk to me about it. I haven't really had a lot of conversations with him, and I don't think the landowners were happy with the contractor either, but that doesn't surprise me. So they did get a new contractor to do this, and I haven't heard if they feel better about it. It definitely looks better, in my opinion. I think I showed this one last year, but it's such a good example. I can't get over this example. I just stumbled across these pictures. Lake Francis, native vegetation. I mean, there was some like landscaping here, but there was a lot of good, submergent, emergent vegetation in front. It really provided a good buffer protection from wave action. They did a bunch of things without a permit, put in the limestone retaining wall. I mean, that was only 6 years. 6 years. And then all of this is starting to erode. It's a mess, right? All the vegetation is gone. Came back, had to get a permit. Again, this was before riprap was considered a permitted use. So then they had to get a conditional use, and they put vegetation. Looks a lot better. And then I went back out in 2021, but I think this was like in November. But look, we got some of that native stuff growing again. I was really happy to see that the seed bank was still there. Even though this had been almost 10 years later, it was still there, and I was happy to grow. And now that the water's low too, I've noticed this a lot on the shorelines. You get out this spring, see if there is some native vegetation that pops up. High water, it does contribute to like suppressing some of that vegetation, but it's kind of great that it's growing now. Hopefully it will stay there. But it looks a lot better. Yet they just left it alone. They wouldn't have had to go through all this permitting, pay all this money, and then we end up right here. So again, retaining walls do not work right next to the shoreline. This one was tricky too. So this was retaining wall next to the shoreline. Bluff, this thing's about ready to go. And it's just tipping. So what I was having, it was very expensive. I mean, there's a boathouse there. It's expensive to replace it. If you remove it, what is that gonna look like, right? Like, what is the time frame to replace that? Is it gonna create some type of issue where that bluff's gonna go? And keep in mind, their bluff is pretty much fully vegetated too. So like, we're really in a tight squeeze here. I had a hard time. I mean, we have the boathouse here. We want to protect that. So what the landowner ended up doing was getting riprap installed all on the shoreline, protect this. And then what we did was we put it in front of the retaining wall. I say this with caution. There's only been 2 projects that I've had to do that for with riprap in front of a retaining wall. I don't like it, but I did put an approval in there, like if this project fails, because there is a good chance this is still gonna tip. But this is not, essentially, the landowner is responsible for that maintenance. The county is not, because it's gonna help, it's gonna buy you time, but this still needs to be addressed. What the answer is, I don't know. They're probably gonna need an engineer and more than likely a CUP. I did suggest maybe cutting off the top 2 tiers up there because it's a lot of weight. Maybe that would reduce the pressure and it wouldn't fall as much, but this is bluff too. So any type of digging and cutting in the bluff, they would need a CUP. So we made it work for them. It's not the best case scenario. Well, this is kind of another picture of what it looked like. Again, it's all vegetated, so that was great. That made me really happy, but this is the problem. Like, it's 4 feet, 5 feet tall. What are we gonna do with it? So then they at least put riprap in front of the boathouse, you know, that protects that a little bit better. And like I said, it's up here. Project construction wasn't done yet, but, you know, just kind of supported it a little bit more. They're still gonna have to do something with that retaining wall. We talked about drilling in holes in the wall and like kind of putting cables or tiebacks for it, but this is why retaining walls are not a good thing, especially next to the shoreline, because now there's bluff there, so we have to figure out how to remove that, build the bluff sloughing, and then the water's coming from both on the top by the house down the bluff and from the lakeside, and it's putting pressure on this retaining wall, and it's gonna fail. So again, retaining walls don't work next to water. That's just some more pictures of it. Temporary fix in my mind, but it's also really expensive. So something we just had to work with. Oh, so remember that bluff that's left? This is what they did. So again, this was before I started, but they had, the bluff had left. They had, you know, they already had done something similar to this before that bluff left water. Then they did it again, right? Like they fixed it again, did all these retaining walls. And this is already failing. Like this was only a couple of years old and it was already failing. It was falling apart. And they can't get an engineer to certify that this is going to work. If a retaining wall is over 4 feet tall, you have to get an engineer to certify it, and they can't. This is not, after you just had your bluff slough, this is not a good idea. It should be left alone, minimal disturbance. This is extreme. It's not helping. I don't know what this property looks like now, but I have a feeling they'll be calling us at some point. Tatanka, that's where that bluff slope. And it was 3 properties too. So I think what actually happened was this landowner was working on this, did all this work, then it slept, and I took this property and this property with it, part of it. So now both of these landowners on this side have to pay for it because this landowner did all this work. I'm not saying it's 100% their fault, but I guarantee like the work that they did before it and what they did now is not helping their bluff. It's still impacting them and their neighbors. And the rain obviously didn't help either. So we really try not to do retaining walls in the bluff either as much as possible. I would prefer an engineer certified it in bluff because again, it's sensitive substrate. It's very difficult to work with. This is something we definitely don't want to see. I don't see a lot of applications like this anymore, thank goodness, but they're not great.
Those engineers can certify something like that. It's not gonna-
Yep, exactly,
Those can fail.
exactly.
Certify.
Yep, so, yeah, that's why if we don't do this, we can avoid that, but yeah, the engineers can't sign off. Like, that was my assumption, was they just know this isn't gonna work.
They know it's gonna fail, and they certainly won't certify it as something they didn't design.
Yep, and, oh, that was the other thing, so Landowners were trying to find a contractor that did this. Disappeared. I don't know where they went, but they can't find them. They can't get that certification. So the landowner's now stuck in a really hard spot because they're trying to fix this, right? And then they can't find anyone to sign off on it. So what are they supposed to do? It's a mess. Yeah, and now it doesn't work, right? And it's falling apart. They're gonna have to come in at some point because this isn't gonna last forever. I know it. I just know it. This is another example of retaining wall. This one was pretty recent. It's on Lake Only. This. So there used to be stairs there. It was really unsafe. This is all crumbling. And this retaining wall is maybe like 8 feet tall. I can see it was doing this. It was leaning. And the landowners were like, oh my goodness, we have grandkids. I don't want them running in front of there and that wall falls on them. So what I did was I went out there, did a site visit, basically said, hey, if you want to remove these top ones, because they're not really holding, I mean, maybe 4 blocks or something. Again, alleviates that weight, buys them some time, and then they had to come back in. So this was done before they bought the property. In this case, kind of is what it is. What this looks like to me is someone cut the bluff, put it out, made a nice flat area, and put a big wall right there to hold it back. That's what it looks like to me. I guarantee the slope was more gradual, but they wanted a flat area. So again, this was during construction, so what they did was they did some grading, and it was more stable to have multiple retaining walls instead of one big one that was 8 feet tall. These blocks are a little big, but they are going to plant some vegetation to screen it, so that should help a lot. And they do have tile behind it too. So hopefully that will help. It was a tough one, right? Like they didn't put the retaining wall there. It was failing. What are they going to do? I definitely think having a couple of retaining walls, not quite as high, was a better solution than one big tall one. Ideally, we wouldn't have any, but again, they had kind of had existing issues. The vegetation should help too, as far as screening that. And the last example I have, so that was that same property that had all that impervious surface, right? Before they did that, when I went out there, because I was asking them a ton of questions, and there was an old grinder pump that was in there. They were trying to remove it. And it was right next to the bluff up here. And so when they started digging, trying to remove it, the bluff started to go. And they're like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? So they put up their retaining walls up there to hold it back. I don't think it was necessarily the worst idea. They still needed a permit. This potentially could have been the emergency stabilization project. I mean, that was something they ran across and they didn't know was there. It's another example of a type of project. Whether I think this was the best idea ever, probably not. But also the grinder pump was there and they were just removing it and this happened. Like that was an emergency situation. They had to do something. As far as alternatives, you know, like I don't know if erosion control measures would have. I wasn't there in the situation, so this is kind of what I'm, you know, telling you what they told me. That was like their resort to doing that. Like I said, I don't know if it's good or bad necessarily, but it's more justifiable than just putting a retaining wall up to put it up, right? Like there was something that was going on. So that's the end.